but again, very adept at understanding some of the cultural pressure. So I'm not at all trying to say that I don't believe in that. At the same time, I'm also critical of scholars who say that end of story, that basically all we have to do is look at the pharmaceutical industry because that's the beginning and the end of this process. And in the stuff I do, I say that just the rhetoric of just blaming the drug companies in a way gets us off the hook of examining the ways in which drug companies don't so much create gender trends or gender norms particularly specifically as they do recognizing norms that already exist in American and Canadian, I'll say a bit about Canadian ads actually, what we do at the end, culture, and then kind of putting medications into this. And so in some ways, if we look at the process of medicalization, it also tells us something about the normative categories in which we define illness and health, in addition to telling us something about psychiatric drugs. And certainly, when you look through the history of pharmaceutical campaigns or pharmaceutical advertising, you can see, I think, a lot of examples of the ways in which the rhetoric of psychiatric drugs doesn't create new social trends about gender. What it does is encapsulate existing anxieties about gender that already exist in American popular culture. And I just want to give you two quick historical examples of that before getting to the present day. And the examples I'm going to show you come from the work that I've done in pharmaceutical advertising. So one quick example comes from the 1950s. Now, the 1950s were a time of tremendous gender conservatism in the United States. And there were a series of arguments going around, basically, that there were two things going on. One was that there was a crisis of masculinity in the United States in the 1950s. American men were all of a sudden suffering from low self-esteem, low wages, poor confidence, premature ejaculation, all these kind of problems. This was all in the popular literature. And that the problem that was causing this was not some big socio-political process. Instead, the argument was that the men's low self-esteem and low confidence was being caused by a single group of culprits, namely American women, American mothers in specific, who had become too big and bad and mean, and they had created a rhetoric where basically they were ruling over men in the domestic sphere, causing men to feel very kind of wimpy. And I think the most important person who was perpetuating this narrative was a man named Philip Wiley, who wrote a book in the 1940s, which for 10 years was on the top 10 of the New York Times bestseller nonfiction list. And the book was called Generation of Vipers. Now, anybody here read this book by any chance? So for people who have read it, basically the argument he's making is that these women were lording over men and causing them to become really wimpy. And he coins this term called momism. And basically, that was the point. And if you look through American popular culture at the time, you'll see a host of representations in which these big bad women are lording over their men. So here's an advertisement, an image, a series of images from The Nation, which were these famous kind of Osborne cartoons that basically showed big bad mama dragging around her teeny little husband by the nose. And for people who know short stories, there were short stories like The Secret Life of Walter Mitty by James Thurber that kind of tell this similar story about how men basically were trying to escape these oppressive women. And the simple point I want to make is that if you look at pharmaceutical advertisements from the same time period, you can see a reflection of these assumptions about basically enlarged, empowered women in cultural representations of psychiatric drugs. Now, the ads I'm going to show you all come from the American Journal of Psychiatry and the Archives of General Psychiatry, two leading psychiatric drugs. And what I'll say is that if you start to look through these images, you start to see a replaying of this in 1950s ads that look like this. So on one hand, if we looked at this ad, this is an ad for Deprol from the early 1950s, a sedative. And you can see that at first glance, the physician should be the authority figure in this image. He's the one with the white coat. He's got these groovy pens. He's got this authoritative framed license up on the wall. But I think somebody looking at this ad in a medical journal at the time would have, I think, subtly noticed that there was a phantasmagorically placed, very enlarged, married woman presented as a kind of visual threat to the physician viewer in ways that subverted this particular social order. Now, if you're doubting me on that one, just trust me that I've got a series of advertisements, literally stacks of them on my desk, and I reproduce a lot of them in my book. Here's a poor guy who had a long day at work. All he wants is some peace and quiet to eat his peas. And instead he's got to come home and deal with big bad mama who's shaking her hand at him. This is again an advertisement for a sedative tranquilizer from the 1950s. Probably one of my favorites of this particular era, and my second favorite overall, was an ad for a medication called Librium. This is an ad that appeared inside the front cover of the Archives of General Psychiatry in the early 1960s. And you can see that this ad visually paints a circle of threatening, visually intimidating women. So here's mom, who's so big and mean that she's stepping outside the circle. Here's daughter, who my students, forgive me for saying, call her biatch in training. Here's the wife, who's assuming the pose, and here's mother-in-law. And they all surround teeny little him, who looks like Pee Wee Herman used to in the old days, and teeny little son down here. Now think about that for a minute. This is an advertisement for a tranquilizer, for a benzodiazepine medication. And the question is, what is the message of this particular advertisement? And of course, these are all open interpretation. So you could say these are ads like, almost like a precursor to a Viagra ad, where him should take the medication and grow big and powerful. But I think the numbers bear out, particularly about the kind of prescription trends that were happening at the time and the formation of the category of mother's little helper, that the message to me seems pretty clear, which is that these are tranquilizing meds that are proposed to treat these intimidating women in the 1950s. Now, jump forward to the 1970s for one more historical example. The 1970s were a time when the gender mores, at least in the United States, changed quite a bit. Instead of the married woman being the nexus of kind of what we might stereotypically call male anxiety, all of a sudden it was the single woman who was presented, at least in American popular culture. Women were in revolt. Women were rebelling against what was called the male-female role system. You saw articles across the American media that basically say women are learning karate, they're rebelling, they're becoming lesbians, they're doing all these things, they're rejecting men. There was a famous Gloria Steinem quote that was on a t-shirt, "A woman needs a man like a fish needs a bicycle." And the message basically at the time was that women didn't need men. And if you look at pharmaceutical advertisements for during this same time period, the late 1960s and early 1970s, you see a replaying of this theme. And so what you see in these ads is the married woman really disappears from pharmaceutical advertisements in the 1960s and 1970s. And all of a sudden you see these single women. Now again, this is open to interpretation, but to my mind, here's an ad for Valium, another benzodiazepine, and what you see, to me, is an outer ring of what we might call a castrating feminist woman, in line with maybe some of the comments we heard before about feminism, and who's kind of baring her teeth kind of in a castrating pose. And as she takes more and more and more Valium, she becomes, I can't remember, it's centripetally or centrifugally calmed. So by the point she gets there, she's the kind of complacent woman that we all want her to be. My personal favorite ad, actually, were a series of 2 advertisements that ran in July and August of 1971 in the Archives of General Psychiatry. Again, these were ads that appeared inside the front cover. This is an ad that, when it first appeared in June, told a visual narrative of a woman named Jan, who in 1955 had a happy childhood playing tennis with Dad, and then it had a series of kind of loser, unsuccessful relationships. So she had the kind of James Dean-like guy Joey, the kind of Charles Atlas guy Charlie, the kind of drunken, groping, don't touch me at the party guy Bunny down there. And these are all kind of arranged in kind of chronological order. And by the end, we see this last photograph of Jan in 1970, who's standing alone on a ship. Now, the first time I saw this ad, I thought, well, that means that Jan got so depressed that this is like her pre-suicide picture, and really what she did after this was jumped off into the icy waters, and that this is an ad about depression, because Valium at the time was being used also as what we might call an antidepressant now. But if you read the text, you see that that's not the case. It says, "The purser on her cruise ship took the last snapshot of Jan. You probably see many such Jans in your practice. The unmarrieds with low self-esteem. Jan never found a man to measure up to her father. Now she realizes, present tense, that she is in a losing pattern and that she may never marry." So again, it drives her to a psychiatrist, and the reason it tells us in the text is because she is 35 and single and unable to find a man. Now, here's the fun part about doing this research. Again, this is in one of the probably top 2 psychiatric journals at the time. This is the ad as it appeared in June. Look closely, because here's what happened when the ad reappeared in August. Let me show you that again. Here's June, and here's what the ad looked like when it reappeared in August. And what you can see is that all of a sudden this word psychoneurotic has been added to the text, as if to imply that the failure to attract a man might not have been Jan's only reason for seeing a psychiatrist, and maybe there was something like, oh, say, a mental illness involved. But intelligent viewers that we are, we can also see that really nothing else in this image has changed whatsoever, and that in this case, the pictures really do tell the story, which is that the single, rebellious, possibly lesbian or isolated or feminist or whatever woman is presented as the vector of pathology in ways that would have had tremendous resonance in the 1970s when this ad was appearing.